קם אדם בבוקר ומרגיש כי הוא עם, הוא מתחיל ללכת ולכל הנפגש בדרכו קורא ושלום. פתאום קם.
Chag Sameach. Welcome to this teaching. I'm Rabbi Catharine Clark, the rabbi at Congregation or Shalom in London, Ontario. My topic for this evening is Got Milk, the work of breastfeeding, and teaching in anticipation of Shavuot. When I first taught this, it was at a Shavuot retreat, and I and many of the students in the class were either breastfeeding or pregnant. So it was an intense topic then. It's an intense topic now because it's also about work more generally, a topic that is fraught for many people as there's been so much job loss, and for other people that their jobs have been considered essential work, and so they're at risk doing their work. It's a topic that gives us lots to think about, and I think that these texts about breastfeeding give us an interesting perspective on it. I'm going to begin with Mishnah Ketubot. The following are the kinds of work which a woman must do for her husband. She grinds and bakes, launders, cooks, and nurses her child, makes the bed, and works in wool. If she brought one bondswoman into the marriage, she does not grind or bake or launder. If two bondswomen, she does not cook or nurse her child. If three bondswomen, she does not make the bed or work in wool. If four bondswomen, she sits on a soft seat. So the text sets forth that there are 7 kinds of work that a woman must do for her husband: grinding and baking, grinding flour, grinding grain and baking, doing laundry, cooking, nursing her child, making the bed, and working in wool. So 7 types of work. And I think one of the things that's interesting is that they are these labors can be delegated in a set order, depending on how many servants she has, and particularly how many servants she brought into the marriage. So all the work is essential, but she only has to do it if there's not other people to be doing it. Another thing that's interesting about these 7 types of labor is that they are owed to the husband, not to herself, not to God, not to the other people into the household, not to the child, interestingly, for nursing. She owes this labor to her husband. And I think it's particularly interesting for the labor of nursing her child. You could imagine that would be something that she would owe to the child, him or herself, that it could be something that she owes to God, as God is a partner in the creation of this child. It could be something that she owes to herself. Instead, they're saying no, it is owed to her husband. And I think one of the interesting questions about this is, why is it owed to her husband? And I think the answer to that is probably that the husband is the only one who could enforce it. The child obviously has an intense interest in this, especially in the time of the Mishnah or the time of the Talmud, when there wasn't formula, there weren't a lot of other options for keeping a newborn in particular, or an infant, to have enough to eat. So nursing was essential, and it needed to be done. And so somebody who could actually ensure that that happened, besides the woman who was doing the nursing, would be the husband if she didn't want to do it or couldn't do it for whatever reason. So that, I think, is the reason that the obligation is owed to the husband. The next text that I want to take a look at is from Bechorot. The Gemara cites the entirety of the previously mentioned Baraita. A Baraita is a teaching from the time of the Mishnah that's not recorded in the Mishnah. The sages taught that a non-kosher fish spawns its offspring, while a kosher fish lays eggs. Any animal that gives birth to its offspring nurses them, and any animal that lays eggs gathers food and feeds it to its young. This applies to all animals except for a bat, atalef, as though it as although it lays eggs, it nurses its young. So this is an interesting text about the rabbi's understanding of the natural world. And it, on its face, doesn't apply necessarily to humans. We are a type of animal, but perhaps they didn't think of us that way. But they're saying that any that gives birth to its offspring nurses them. That makes it sound like nursing is a totally natural activity. The thing about natural activities, though, is that they don't usually have to be legislated, as this Mishnah is doing. It's making rules about when someone nurses and who nurses. In the case if there's a servants in the house, if there are servants in the household, who nurses. So if it were a completely natural activity, no one has to legislate for me when I go to bed at night or when I sleep, or that I do sleep, because it's a natural activity. Nursing is a natural activity, but it's not always quite that simple. There are times when it doesn't happen, either because of it's just not possible. The mother is not producing milk, or the baby won't suck, or the baby is too ill to suck right away. There's other instances where it can't happen because the mother and child are separated, or in the United States, where I had my first baby, maternity leave is 6 weeks, so maybe there's nursing for a little while, but not for very long, because the mother and the child can't be together during most of the day. All sorts of reasons why it isn't totally a natural activity. It's also really hard. I think it's important to acknowledge that. At least it can be. So when the mother and the child are first trying this, especially if the mother is a new mother, neither one of them really knows what they're doing, and it isn't easy. Sometimes the baby won't latch, and you can't figure out why. Sometimes it hurts, and you can't figure out why, and it takes some practice. Those are reasons why it might need to be legislated, because it isn't all as simple as you might say. Oh, it's totally natural and it can just happen. And sometimes that's really not the case for all sorts of reasons. So going back to the first text from Mishnah Ketubot, it goes on to say about how many servants they brought into the marriage. What happens next? What Rabbi Eliezer says, even if she brought him 100 bondswomen, he compels her to work in wool, for idleness leads to unchaste behavior. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, if a man forbade by vow his wife from doing any work, he must divorce her and give her ketubah money to her, for idleness leads to boredom. So Rabbi Eliezer says that work is valuable for women, even if they have the means to avoid doing it. If they have 100 servants who can work for them, must have been quite the household. She still has to do work in wool, which is one of the 7 labors that were set forth in the early part of the text, where it says she has to grind, bake, do laundry, cook, nurse her child, make the bed, and work in wool. Even if she has 100 bondswomen, she must work in wool, because if a woman doesn't, it might lead to unchaste behavior. So for Rabbi Eliezer, I think it's important to acknowledge that to him, the purpose of work is to control the worker. In this case, the woman who would be working in wool. That's problematic. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel has a different reason for why women should work. They need to work because if they don't, it leads to boredom. And I think there's some truth to that, a lot of truth to that, in fact. Some work is fulfilling. Some work encourages one to use their mind or their skills in a way that is interesting and captures our attention, and not having anything we must produce can make it really hard to feel like we have a purpose in what we do with our day. Work gives structure to the day. It gives structure to the week. When we have Shabbat, we know it will help. because we have Shabbat, we know on Monday morning that there will be a break to our work at some point. That's an important feeling. It gives us a sense of that there's a pattern to the day. Some of us have been missing that pattern to the days recently, and that's really tough. It makes things feel too up in the air. And this is saying, they have the work on the wool. You start one project, you finish it. You've switched from weaving to maybe doing embroidery. You have a sense of accomplishment from one thing to the other, and that can help avoid boredom. The problem with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's idea is, like, let's be honest, what the work is that we're talking about here. The work from the first part of the Mishnah is she grinds grain, bakes bread, launders, cooks, and nurses her child, makes the bed, and works in wool. Some of that work is more interesting than others, at least potentially. I can imagine that grinding grain is pretty repetitive. The difference between grinding oats and grinding wheat would not be particularly exciting or intriguing. Baking, for some people who enjoy it and are good at it and have the resources to work with, yes, that can be something to keep our minds occupied. That must be why there are so many people I know on my Facebook feed posting pictures of their sourdough loaves. It is something to do, and it's a sense of accomplishment. Laundering, also, at least from speaking for myself, not one of the more interesting tasks I engage in. Cooking, that is a type of work that, at least for some people, if you have the means to work with quality ingredients that aren't all the same every single day, you have the equipment to work with it, it can be very fulfilling. It's definitely something to do, and you can try, in our world, we can try, we can make Indian one night and Greek the next, and it's interesting. You learn something about the cultures whose food you're cooking, and it's not boring. But if you're cooking just because everybody in your family needs to eat 3 meals a day, and you don't have much to work with, I'm not sure Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is correct that it's not going to lead to boredom. Nursing one's child is an interesting case, because when you're nursing a child, you're also interacting with the baby, even when they're almost asleep, even when you're almost asleep, which definitely happens when, at least in the first month or so, that you can almost be asleep and still have that be happening. But in the best case scenario, it's a chance to interact with a new mind, and a mind that's in a person that you love more than anything else in the world, and that is a special opportunity. But it doesn't always feel like that, and it's important to acknowledge that too, especially in the early weeks of a child nursing, when that's pretty much all that anyone does all the time. It's boring, and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel might not have been aware of that, at least not from personal experience. Making the bed and working in wool. And working in wool is the one that no matter how well off you are, that's the one that you're going to be doing. We know from other texts from around the time of the Mishnah and the Talmud that unlike in our world, where clothes are fairly abundant and easily acquired, pretty easily acquired, and not worth anything once you've purchased them. Like, once you've purchased them and you can no longer return them, they have no value for the most part. That was not the case in the ancient or medieval world. We know from the Cairo Geniza that clothes or table linens or bed linens are listed as assets that come into a marriage or have to be divided up when the marriage ends. So these were making, if a woman is working in wool, she is making goods that are valued by her society and not that easily attained. So that also might to fend off the boredom from doing that particular kind of work. Ramon Shimon ben Gamliel definitely has a point there. Rashi takes a look at the word for boredom, shiamum, and translates it differently. He says that it can mean insanity or craziness. And there are some sorts of work or repetitive work that that can drive a person almost nuts. And I think it's important to acknowledge that when we're talking about work. Some people's work is fascinating for themselves and for others, and for other people, they are not that fortunate. Their source of meaning doesn't come from work, and in fact, that the work can drive them nuts. Everybody has times when their work can drive them nuts, rabbis included. Shh, little secret there. Definitely breastfeeding, at least in the first month or two, can make you feel like you're nuts, possibly because you're so tired, but it also could be other things going on there. But that's Rashi's idea about what we're trying to fend off here. It's fending off craziness. However he defined that, which I'm not sure, but that could be an interesting topic too. Okay. The next text that I want to take a look at is from the tractate Ketubot from the Talmud, which is a discussion of the Mishnah that we started with, and they're talking about what happens in situations where there's disagreement about whether she's going to be doing this work or not. So Rav Huna said, Rav Huna bar Hinana tested us by asking, if she says that she wants to nurse and he says that he does not want her to nurse, but rather to give the child to a wet nurse, we accede to her desires, as she is the one suffering from engorgement of her breast. However, if he says that he wants her to nurse and she says that she does not want to nurse, what is the halakha? He then narrowed the scope of the question. Anywhere that she is not accustomed, as the women of her family generally do not nurse their children, but give them to wet nurses. Instead, we accede to her desires. However, if she is accustomed to nursing and he is not accustomed, meaning the women of her family generally nurse their babies, but the women in his family do not, what is the halakha? Do we follow his wishes to follow her family custom? Or do we follow her wishes to follow his family custom? And we answered his question from this Amoraic statement. When a woman marries a man, she ascends with him to his socioeconomic status, if it is higher than hers, but she does not descend with him if his status is lower. Consequently, if his family is not accustomed to nurse, she is not obligated to nurse either. So, they're imagining a dispute here where one person in the couple says she should nurse the baby and another person in the couple says she should not nurse the baby. If she wants to, she nurses. That's the baseline that they're going with here. There's an instance where she is saying she doesn't want to nurse and he wants her to nurse. And what that will depend on is whether he is from a family in which women nurse their children. And it seems to be associated with socioeconomic status in the sense that the wealthier you are, the less likely you are to nurse your child. That in that instance, you'll hire a wet nurse. And if she's from a family of lower socioeconomic status and he's from a higher socioeconomic status and the women in his family don't have the custom of nursing their children, then she says she doesn't want to, then they have to hire a wet nurse. If she's from a higher economic status than he is, where women in her family generally don't nurse their children, and he's from a lower economic status, she doesn't descend with him in socioeconomic status. She still won't have to nurse if that's what she wants to do. So it's interesting these ideas about socioeconomic status and nursing, and work in general, and socioeconomic status. Sometimes what a job pays doesn't exactly correlate with its status. There are other things that go into the status of particular types of work, and nursing, which we know from other texts in the Talmud in the Middle Ages was not a high-paying job, also was associated, at least in some instances, with lower socioeconomic status. This is, I think, changed a little bit, at least from my experience and today, because at least in some countries, the United States in particular, where I'm from and where I had my first child, and so many jobs not having maternity leave, not having parental leave, it was more common to breastfeed if you were of higher socioeconomic status, because you had the time to do so. And you were in the same place as your child for most of the day. It's an interesting statement on whether the tension between breastfeeding as not being compensated work and other types of employment being compensated work, whether some women get to breastfeed or not, regardless of whether they want to. So sometimes it's just not an option because of other obligations, other socioeconomic obligations. So another text from Ketubot from earlier, but still discussing in the Talmud, the Mishnah that we started this lesson with. It says, the Mishnah mentions among a wife's obligation that she nurses her child. The Gemara suggests, let us say that the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Beit Shammai, as it is taught in a Braita. If a woman took a vow not to nurse her child, Beit Shammai say, since she vowed, she must remove her nipple from his mouth and not nurse him. Beit Hillel say her husband can compel her and she must nurse the child even against her will. However, if she is divorced and therefore has no further obligations to her husband, he cannot compel her. Nevertheless, if the baby recognized her, then even after the divorce, her husband must pay her a salary as a wet nurse and compel her to nurse due to the danger that the child will starve if he refuses to nurse from another woman. The Braita indicates that according to Beit Shammai, a woman has no obligation to nurse her child. If she had a prior obligation to her husband to nurse the child, the vow would not take effect. So, but to look at what Beit Hillel said, I think this is really interesting. So it's talking, when it says that if she's divorced from her husband, she no longer owes that work to her husband. So he can't compel her to nurse her child if they're divorced. But except in one instance, which is a very crucial instance, if the baby recognizes her, that means, and that idiom means that if the baby will only nurse from her, then he can compel her, and he has to compensate her for doing that. He has to pay her so that she will nurse the child, because if she didn't, there'd be a grave danger to the child. I think that in this is a really interesting reminder about breastfeeding and about work. We don't pay women to breastfeed their children, but in this particular instance, a limited circumstance, I grant, one where the couple is divorced and where the child will only nurse from her, he has to pay for her to nurse the child. And you can see why that might be the case. One of the things that affects the quality of the milk and the quantity of the milk that a woman can produce to nourish her child is the quality and the quantity of the food that she is able to afford to eat. And there's plenty of evidence in the Talmud that having enough to eat was not a given many, many families and for many, many women. And so he has to pay her so that she can afford to eat and feed the child. So to sort of shift the focus away from breastfeeding to the concept of work, I want to just summarize some of the things that we've looked at. What we learned about work from studying the particular case of breastfeeding. So one of the things that we learned about work is that it's done because of responsibility to someone else. Most people take great pride in their job and sometimes identify in the role that they do their work in, and so most tasks they feel self-motivated to do, but not all of them. And sometimes it's because I have to do this because someone else is expecting me to do it. I have a responsibility to them, which I am obligated to do it, and they have ways of enforcing those obligations. Work is also something that sometimes can be delegated. It can be given to, in the instance that we looked at in the Mishnah, it can be given to servants to do depending on what it is. And many people have jobs where things are delegated to them, and they delegate also other tasks to other people. That's one of the hallmarks of work. Work can sometimes, although not always, be personally fulfilling. Instances where that's most likely to happen is if it requires some sort of specialized skill to do, if it involves working with nice materials, if it's appreciated. Those are key ways to know if you like your work. Work is sometimes a way to control other people's behavior. That is the text that we looked at from Rabbi Eliezer, that women need to work, because if they don't have to work, they're going to be doing things, particularly sexual things, that they're not supposed to be doing. Work can sometimes, often, I hope, for most of us, feel meaningful and productive. It can stave off boredom. That's the Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel's approach to why a man can't just decide that the woman he's married to isn't going to do any work at all. That's not fair to her. She deserves a sense of fulfillment and productivity in her life also. Work can sometimes expand your mind. It can increase connections to people around you. In the particular case of breastfeeding, it increases your connection to the child, at least in most instances. Work is connected to status. Some jobs are higher status than others. And sometimes not working, in the instance of if you have 100 bondswomen, not working or not doing much labor is the highest status of all. And the last text that we looked at is that work is paid. We sometimes, so much of the work that women do in their lives is not compensated. And the idea that in some instances it will be compensated, even nursing her own child in the Talmud, there are instances in which it will be compensated. That's an important thing to keep in mind as we consider work and what women are doing, especially as the economy hopefully recovers in the future. So it was wonderful to teach with you this evening. I hope that you learned some things and thought about both breastfeeding and work in ways that we don't always make explicit. And as it's Shavuot, I hope that you enjoy a rest from your work and return to it soon with energy and find fulfillment in it. Chag Sameach.
בוקר ותשמע
טוב ממך שואלת, מהר ארצה תהי נוחלת, מיד